I'm afraid I'll
But
pause.
we're on the air. Okay.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Carl Raschke. I'm the moderator for tonight's critical conversation, sponsored by the Global Art and Ideas Nexus. And we want to welcome tonight Alan J. Richard, who is our special guest, who is with Realistic Living and is also a consultant to various community initiatives over the years. I've known Alan since he was an undergraduate student of mine many years ago at the University of Denver, and since went on to get his Ph.D. from Syracuse University. He's going to be talking about religious praxis as emancipatory and utopian. And he was going to explain what that means. I think I've got a good idea what I know about the very interesting and exciting experiments and undertakings they've been doing for years at Realistic Living, which is not just simply a community, it's a whole way of transforming life. But before we get to Alan, I'll let Alan kind of say what he wants to about himself. We could just briefly introduce our other discussants here, guests. We'll start with Mary Cody on the left.
Okay, so it's Mary Keller from Cody, Wyoming, and I was a colleague of Alan's at Syracuse University, and my current work is on Indigenous studies theory and the idea of what is the Indigenous in a globalized world, with a real emphasis on climate issues and social justice.
Okay. Joshua?
Okay. Well, I am currently a doctoral student in the joint Ph.D. program facilitated by Iliff School of Theology and the University of Denver. Carl Raschke is my advisor. I've been a colleague and friend of Alan's for a number of years now. Have participated with him in some of these creative experiments of praxis, and look forward to participating in the conversation.
Okay, and then Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Brownlie. I'm in Houston, Texas, and I've been working in youth work for many, many years, but I also have been involved with a lot of community action and outreach, and come from a background of very progressive thought when it comes to theology. And I've known Alan for a number of years.
Okay, Alan, and so tell us a little bit more about yourself, or what you'd like us to know about yourself before you start explaining a little bit about your topic.
Well, my sort of adventure with religion goes back a long ways. I was a charismatic evangelical in high school during a period of time when I was also having a passionate affair with another guy who was in my prayer group. So my encounter with religion from the very beginning was a little bit off kilter, unexpected in terms of what most people think of as religion. I then became a student of a guy named Carl Raschke at Syracuse University, encountered Kierkegaard, and began losing my evangelical, charismatic, dogmatic slumber, only to be thrust into a series of experiences that were both this worldly and religious. Beginning with some very bizarre things that happened to me and Carl in undergraduate school, and then of course the AIDS crisis and my involvement in ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which I still think of as in some ways the peak religious experience of my life, and the paradigm of how I imagine religion as emancipatory political action. I studied with Charles Winquist at Syracuse University, but before I graduated, I was already focused on doing work on HIV and AIDS, and for the next 17 years, my career was in public health. And I did HIV and AIDS epidemiology and prevention research, and then worked with a series of community-based organizations to help them develop interventions, test interventions, and of course also raise money. And then in 2010, I moved out into the middle of nowhere and joined Realistic Living, which is an existentialist Christian organization that comes out of a movement that began in the 1950s, actually, coming out of Perkins Theological Seminary. Its mission really is to reformulate, refigure what Christianity can be in the 21st century.
Okay, so you're going to talk about religious practice as emancipatory and utopian. I know that's not exactly your title, but those are the kind of terms or markers that come to mind here. Tell us a little bit about what this means, particularly in terms of the praxis part of it, which, you know, I've been to your Bonham site there before. We've talked about it. I've done some seminars with you in the past, and heard you talk about the kind of big picture or grand plan. But I'll let you talk, not just give you my impressions.
Well, the way I'm using the term utopian is not as some sort of common vision of the good life, where you basically take the basic structure that already exists and try to imagine something that you know, sort of makes sense within that structure. I think utopianism is the opposite of that. It means something that is barely imaginable, or not completely imaginable at all. In fact, you begin the practice before you can really imagine what it will be. And the way that this works is that rather than making demands on the state structure, rather than seeking a sort of policy change, which would still imply a kind of command structure that is part of what you're against, you begin to work in ways consensually to develop small-scale, this worldly embodiments of what this utopia, this non-place, might look like. You do this aesthetically, and you engage in political action that is also an expression of art, also an expression of ethics, and isn't just about, you know, changing policy, but again, it's about changing you, about rewiring your own neurons, so to speak, rewiring your synapses. So this is the kind of practice I'm interested in.
Okay, and so can you talk a little bit about both the kind of thinking behind it, the sort of intellectual framework in which it's been developed, and maybe some of the very concrete things that you're doing, or some of the things you'd like to be doing you're not doing, but you're trying to get going?
Well, okay, so for me, it involves elements of what I've learned and just picked up in a number of ways from permaculture development design certification class, from Starhawk's work with reclaiming Wiccan practice, with Vipassana meditation practice, nonviolent direct action practice, which also involves a kind of meditation, and a sort of real-world meditation, radical honesty practice with Brad Blanton, which involves being able to tell the truth as you see it and sit there with the consequences as they occur. And this does involve a certain kind of discipline that doesn't just come naturally to people. We tend to either hold back or we react. So these are some of the kinds of practices I'm talking about. Now, as a collective practice, it involves imagining, for me, because I'm coming out of, I'm using a lot of Christian symbols. It comes out of the imagination of what ecclesia could be. Ecclesia as a radically democratic assembly coming together to make decisions having to do with our place on the planet. And what that might mean. And again, I think if we look at social activism that has really worked, it doesn't just involve sitting around talking. It doesn't even just involve sitting around talking and making signs. It involves singing. It involves dancing. It involves a kind of ecstatic element that I think is what's required to sustain a long-term engagement against what is really a very powerful structure, sort of a swimming upstream, so to speak.
Okay, how do these practices mobilize the community in terms of taking on the structure? I guess what I'm what's coming to mind here is very much like a monastic community, or at least the discipline of a monastic community. Monastic communities had and still do have rules, which are kind of disciplinary structures, which are geared to the kind of intentionality of that particular community. And of course, I know you're not talking about a traditional Christian community. You're talking about something that's much more contemporary, much more ambitious in certain respects, I think, because a traditional monastic community, almost by definition, have been aimed at sort of withdrawal from the world, and you want to change and provoke and get people to alter their lives, not just here and there. It's not like the Amish who saw themselves as fleeing Babylon, but to actually take on Babylon. Is that correct, or not?
Sort of. Although I don't want to knock the Amish too much. I think a kind of engaged exodus is not a bad idea. But the kind of practice and the kind of discipline I'm thinking about really, more than seeing it in monastic communities, I think you see it in, for instance, anarchist political practice. David Graeber's little pamphlet on that talks a lot about what that kind of discipline might be. And I think I want to look at 4 elements, really, and when I do my talk, look at 4 elements. First of all, the transformation of the notion of religion through a kind of dialectical immanence. And what I mean by that is starting where we are, rather than with religion as some kind of timeless thing that sort of exists out there. Starting with what religion, how religion has emerged to be what it is now at this particular time. Because my contention is that religion actually belongs to the age of globalization. It does not predate the age of globalization. There were precedents to what we call religion that were captured by religion in the age of globalization. I would say that what these were the refuse of the Enlightenment, the trash that it threw away, that it placed inside the private sphere and domesticated, or attempted to domesticate, because it never successfully domesticated it. But it's sort of, in a way, in its essence. I think you have to take it to the way the Enlightenment developed the history of religion, beginning with this notion of fetishism, which I think in the Enlightenment becomes the essence of what religion is that the Enlightenment's leaving behind, so-called leaving behind. Of course, it's contemporary with the Enlightenment. But to begin with this, to begin with what religion is as we've received it, rather than imagining it to be something that it isn't, and to begin to work with that in a way to render explicit the implicit emancipatory practice that's already there. I mean, it already is an opposition to the Enlightenment within the Enlightenment already. So that's the first one. The second one is the affirmation of a minimal optimism as a kind of contingent decision. It's just very simple. The way David Graeber puts it, he says it's the first principle of an anarchist theory of politics, which is another world is possible. Another world is possible. Just that minimal faith affirmation. And then imagining a counterpower and fostering the ability to imagine a counterpower through collective, consensual, performative embodiment. And this means just concretely within community developing means of material exchange, gift giving, that that can really form bonds that are strong enough to stand up to global capital. It means developing all sorts of images or pictures of what this might be like. I mean, I'm talking what we might call theater, what we might call song, these kinds of things. Imaginative, performative embodiments. And to develop a religious identity that can affirm its own contingency. And this kind of goes all the way back to that first practice, the imminent transformation of religion. It's to accept that my religious identity is, in some sense, an arbitrary choice. You know, it's a fetish, and so it means that your identity becomes a kind of serious self-parody. I think the person who does this best that I've ever met is Starhawk, who says that there's a perpetual tug of war within her between the pagan priestess and the Jewish comedian. And Starhawk, whenever she sees a ritual getting too serious, too caught up in itself, she'll find a way to break up that seriousness, usually with humor. And if in all of the demonstrations that I've been in where there have been members of her movement that have been participating, there's always been a kind of playfulness to it. There's always been a kind of serious self-parody. And of course, the queer communities have developed this sense of serious self-parody to a fine art. I mean, we were facing police lineups in the demonstrations at the National Institutes of Health. They were on horseback. They were ready to jump on us, attack us. You know, just little sorts of chants that some of these guys would come up with. Your gloves don't match your shoes. They'll see it on the news. You're sort of parodying your own identity, even as you're actually fighting for your life.
Joshua, you had a question. I saw a comment on the side there. You were asking about minimal optimism. Do you want to jump in at this point?
Just wanted to clarify with Alan when he says minimal level of optimism. In other words, you don't get the modifiers likely, probable, certain. These are not right. I just want to make sure that one would not say another world is likely, another world is to come, or another world is probable. It's only possible, right?
That's right.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's important to really draw how minimal. Yeah.
But
we could lose. We could
Right.
lose. But in fact, okay, I would even say it's likely we will lose.
Right.
It's likely we will lose. But in that losing, we will have witnessed to the fact that another world is possible. Religion has been since capitalist globalization became what it is. I would say since to follow Philip Goodchild, since the founding of the Bank of England, religion has been losing and losing and losing, and yet religion continues to be a witness to the possibility of another world.
Let me jump in with a sort of kind of historical sidebar here, because I'm probably the oldest by far in this group, and I go way back. I go way back to the activist period in California and also in New England in the 60s and early 70s when I was in graduate school and so forth. The sort of famous or infamous and somewhat romantic time that I don't think a lot of students today understand that we call the 60s. And particularly the kind of militancy of that particular period, which was trying to overthrow, bring down the system, and it very often it used drama, it used parody. That's where street mime merged with a political theater. That's where the guy to board
situationism, yes,
right, talked about and so forth, and
yes.
it really took hold, and in the long term, it had an effect. And then you have a theologian also at Harvard named Harvey Cox who comes along and writes a book, Feast of Fools, which talks about parody, and he goes back to the Middle Ages and describes how in some ways this was part of this was a way of maintaining a very rigid feudal social hierarchy, but at the same time it also allowed to release steam, and this sort of impulse to parody, make fun of hierarchy and power gradually became a sort of subculture that eventually, particularly after the Black Plague of the 14th century, morphed, and social cohesion was, struck a devastating, almost fatal blow, which allowed for the rise of capitalism. But that sort of morphed into a subculture, which became, in some ways, a nucleus of religious millenarianism and militant political action, which even Marx and Engels recognized. Now, of course, we always talk about capitalism and global capitalism, that or neoliberalism is the term, and that seems to be every progressive's bogey today. Though in my gripe is that very few people take the time to really analyze it as consistently and rigorously as, say, somebody like Karl Marx did in the 19th century, or even somebody like Zizek does today. So my question is, okay, what is it about this global capitalism that you see somehow not impervious, but pervious, even though, as you point out, we might definitely lose. But what is it, I don't know if there's such a word as pervious, but what is it about global capitalism that is pervious to this kind of new radical communitarian strategy that makes it different than, from the hippie communes of the 60s, from the early feminist collectives, and of course, the gay rights movement?
Yeah. Well, I don't have anything against all of those. I would have to say each of them. I mean, some of those hippie communes, like Stephen Gaskin's farm. The English professor from San Francisco, from Berkeley, who took that busload of folks out to Tennessee, that's still going. You know, Stephen's dead now, but the farm is still going. And in fact, it's not just going; it's a center for permaculture, which is a whole different way that it's picked up. You know, and as far as the feminist movement, I think, you know, we wouldn't have had ACT UP if it hadn't been for the feminist movement. The people who had the know-how, you know, in ACT UP. Now, the people who had the desperation were the gay men with HIV, obviously. But they didn't have the background in activism. They didn't know how to organize. It was the feminists, many of whom were also veterans of the anti-war movement from the 60s, who came in with the just the very practical. I mean, they came in with the tradition. Let's put it that way. Okay. So that what we have here is an opposition that is already a long-term, sustained, multi-generational opposition. And then if you look at Occupy, the role that ACT UP veterans played in Occupy, it continues to go on. There is a connection between these things. They're not just flash in the pans and then go away. Although of course there's a punctuality to it too, because you know, there are moments when these movements become more visible. And I would say the indigenous peoples movements, you see a similar thing. There is a continuity that goes back a long, long way. And yet it's punctual as well. I mean, you know, Idle No More is not the American Indian movement. It's something different, you know. But I think that one of the things about these movements that I find interesting and important in terms of global capitalism is that global capitalism is in essence already built on a faith. It has to do with it has its own theology, as Philip Goodchild points out. You know, now it's a theology that you participate in, even if you disavow it, even if you claim that it doesn't claim you. You still participate in it, right? The only choice, if you're talking about withdrawing even partially from that faith, and this is what money is. Money is a promise to pay. Money is not actual wealth. It's a promise of wealth. It's a promise of a promise. So the whole thing falls apart if trust falls apart, if trust in money falls apart. And if people begin valuing other things that in the money economy are trash because they're just the kinds of things that money buys, but that in a world that we can build can be of value, you know, even if that world it consists of 20 people or 30 people in one place, networked with other people. That conferral of value, because what gives something value is not set in necessity, not set in stone. Then this addresses what is really the core issue with global capitalism, in a way that a kind of direct confrontation on the order of a notion that you're going to seize power and then figure out what you're going to do to make everything fair. That notion of revolution doesn't do. So I guess what I value about each of these movements is, in a sense, the revolution is something that you do. It's not something that you demand from the state.
Okay. Does somebody have a microphone? Because there's echo coming all of a sudden. Joshua, you had something you wanted to say.
Would it be okay if I ask Mary from Cody? Right. I liked what she said about the money creates futurity, and I'm curious if she could say maybe a little bit more about that in relation to what Alan was saying. I was talking about this practice as the possibility, or perhaps the reality even, right? The practice is the reality of the other world to which one bears witness. And I think that's intriguing because it fixes the power of the state, which is as powerful as it sometimes feels because it's not fixed. And it seems like a practice like the kind that Alan is referencing works to fix that power and to name it and to circumscribe it in a way unlike how it normally functions, which is this kind of aberrant, it may always be there, it's kind of penetrating every orifice, that kind of feeling. So to have a collective name and fix the power seems pretty essential, kind of anarchic metapolitics, or something to that effect. But I'd like, if it's okay, I'd love Mary.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to say, and then if Cody gets is one of the things that always comes up when we talk about something besides global capitalism, right? Is this whole thing? Well, you know, we can't go back to primitive times. We can't go back to tribal society. We can't go back. But see, the thing is that cuts off any possibility of actually looking at what our contemporaries, not people in the past, but people who are contemporary with us, how they're actually living differently than simple acquiescence to global capitalism. Because these so-called primitives, the trick was, when you talk about the primitive, you're taking people that you live with now, that you share the globe with, and you're placing them in the past as if they aren't your contemporaries. But of course they are. So once you open up the book to looking at these kinds of societies as possible embodiments of a refusal of global capitalism, then you have a lot more ideas to draw from. You have a lot more examples that you can draw from. Because you're not, I mean, it's sort of like saying, well, you know, we can't go back to Chicago. What do you mean? You've never been to Chicago. Chicago's there. It's another place. It's not some place in the past. It's just some place you haven't been. There are people living there.
Mary, do you want to answer Joshua's question? Because I think you deal with indigenous peoples, right? So you have some thoughts about this, what he's saying, in terms of emancipatory praxis, because I think that's a kind of theme. I mean, we're not talking about, returning to the land. We're not talking about any kind of reversion to former types of society and praxis, which is impossible. I mean, that's always a delusion. But in some ways we're seeing new forms of emancipatory praxis coming out of certain kinds of marginalized praxis, particularly religious practices, which have seen as being behind the time, or backward, or otherworldly, or even dysfunctional, and so forth. While I'm talking this way, I'm thinking about, and again, this gets to the critique of enlightenment, talking about Walter Mignolo and his book, The Darker Side of Modernity, where he talks about a kind of new global order, which in some ways allows for these kinds of emancipatory practices on the part of indigenous people who lead the way, and also change the very discourse by which we talk about social justice and so forth.
Yeah, let me see. There's part of me that hears Charles Long in the background, and I'm thinking of, he wrote a really nice little bit in Beyond Primitive, where he discusses the indigenous as that which offers us, at this crisis of self and the meaning of the exchange of objects with others and our dependency on objects, that the indigenous offers us an alternative, literally alternative meanings of matter and the meaning of exchanging and consuming matter, so that if matter itself is understood differently, then some of this transformation of our presence can begin to happen. And I'm thinking of Winona LaDuke. I think it was her grandmother who said to her, does your talk make corn? Right? It's like, if you cannot relate this to that work that we need to do to feed our community and to grow in an ecological relationship of interdependence, then I'm just not so interested in your talking. There has to be a doing that is involved with this. And I think part of what I Don't Know More managed to do with all the rest of us networked, digitized people is to say, in my case, kind of, holy shit, you stand up and make it happen. Right? Like there is an idol no more has a body in relationship to the exchange of matter. So I see some of that happening, and I think what's common in terms of some of the symptoms of our time, right? Not that we're talking about going back, but that all of us are dealing with diabetes. All of us are dealing with obesity. All of us are dealing with these problems of modernity that are environmental wellness is so compromised that, again, part of what the indigenous offers us, I think, is not a romantic return, but contemporary to myself, to the people on the Crow Reservation that I work regularly with, is how do we grow healthy children? So, and I know that that youth and youth outreach and has been part of Rachel's work as well. So I don't want to talk too long here. I've got one note on the side there about a project I'm working on with an organic farmer about because we don't understand what we're doing. For instance, our computer screens are probably burning something like 8,000 calories an hour. And so how many of us are producing those 8,000 calories to support this work? We're not. It's coal that's burning that's producing this. Until we understand our calorie consumption and our energy, we haven't got a clue how to transform. Once you know it's 31,000 calories for a gallon of gas, you got to think to yourself, oh my God, I'm traveling with an army of people on 1 gallon of gas. I could feed 30 people for 2 weeks on these calories, right? So we have no understanding what the Industrial Revolution created us as armies and monsters of energy consumption. And I think I've probably gone sufficiently off the rails with that. So I'll relinquish my mic.
No. In fact, I think we're all talking about that because, Alan, if I'm correct, I mean, in some ways, what your project is, and the project of Realistic Living, is to make us aware of that, to make us, well, to use language from Buddhism, mindful of how we live and how it affects everything. You know, I mean, that certainly has been a kind of indigenous way of thinking. Since the since before prehistory, so to speak, and so forth. So it's that kind of mindfulness about how the meaning, the consequences, the impact of what we do, and so forth, and how, and in that whole idea, which everybody kind of cites this, but nobody really thinks it through, again, in a rigorous way, because so most of us tend to think in terms of very simple moralistic terms. We don't think in terms of economies. That is about how everything is kind of interrelated and how the process of exchange, what we give up, what we do, what we get back, and what somebody else has to do without, and so forth. That's never addressed in this kind of thinking. But if we were more mindful of that, we would have this goal that I think everybody gives lip service to, but doesn't really want to bother to really think, it's through what it means in a very challenging way, and that's this term sustainability. And I think that's what you're trying to, in some ways, push people toward, isn't it? More of a more sophisticated and a more, activist, if not intentional, vision of sustainability in terms of our interrelationships among people and community.
Another way to talk about one of the things that this imagination of a counterpower is about is to create a if you think of religion as a means of directing attention, to direct one's attention to what is really happening and what is masked in a way by the abstractions that we engage in, including the abstraction of money. I think Mary is absolutely right about that. That when you look at on the level of abstraction, you don't see the real costs of what it is that you're doing. It's invisible to us in a way. To become mindful of that, and this is partly why you would have a partial exodus or a partial withdrawal, is not in order to live in a kind of world where all this stuff isn't happening, but in order to give yourself space to develop that kind of attentiveness to the real material stuff and the real material exchanges that make for human exchange, human interdependency. Which again, when it's on the abstract level of money, what this seems to create, what it has created historically, is an illusion that we are not interdependent. We built it, the "we built it" mentality, what we lose sight of, as Marcel Mauss wrote a long time ago, is this foundation of gift exchange on which all economy is actually built.
Rachel,
one illustration that that Levi-Strauss gives of this is he talks about these little country French restaurants where the only place where people of different social classes are made to sit down at a table together. And everyone has their own plate of food and everything, but the wine is usually a cheap local wine. It's brought and it's put on the table, and every person has a little bit of bottle, and the bottles are not evenly filled. Some people have more, some people have less. But what you do is no matter how much or little your bottle has in it, whoever's sitting across from you or sitting next to you, you pick it up and you pour into their glass. That's the first gesture. That gets the movement going. And no matter what their social class is, they could be richer than you, poor, if they ignore that, if they don't reciprocate, if they just pour wine in your glass and then just kind of look down and eat their meal, if they don't begin to relate to you, right? That's just the height of rudeness, and it could cause a fight. I mean, it's not that there's any value in that wine inherently. It's that some material exchange was made. A relationship was started, and to not take the next move and move it on, that's a refusal of that relationship.
Rachel, we haven't heard from you yet, and I think I heard it said here a little while ago that you're doing some very interesting things in a community context and so forth. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing some of that with us. Sure. And let us know kind of how it relates to what Alan's been saying in this whole kind of tenor of discussion. Again, because we're we're really trying to kind of identify forms of concrete praxis as kind of exemplary of this new sustainable set of relationships. You know, I think Alan has a very good point. If we think of economies not in terms of mechanisms, but in terms of forms of relationality, you know, some which work, some don't. You know, some exploit. You know, some alienate. Some actually enhance life. You know, they're life affirming and so forth. And it gets back to the question that was brought up earlier about values. And in some ways, community builders are creators of values, almost in the way that Nietzsche was talking about. He says, "Oh, you creators," you know, because underlying all economies is a system of value. I mean, I think your classical economists understood that. Not just Marx, but people like John Locke and Adam Smith. You know, it gets down to what do you value and how do you put that value into play. So I guess my question is, tell us a little bit about some of the kind of things you're doing and how you're putting these kind of values into play.
Okay, first let me tell you a little bit about my background. I actually, like I said, my family, my parents, were a part of the community that started at Perkins in the 50s and moved to UT Austin, part of that group. And so that framed my childhood. And then my uncle, I just realized, was part of the hippie commune that Alan was talking about that went to Tennessee. So that's my background, my childhood, you know, my childhood background. But what I have been involved with for the last 12, 14 years is a youth community here in Houston that developed out of kids leaving gang life, youth gangs in Houston, and needing to find an alternative to what the gangs were giving them in terms of relationship that they were not getting from fractured families. And this started in about 94, 95. And what brought the group together was hip-hop and the elements of that and what that actually is. And it sounds very odd because for most people, when you think of that, you think of what you see on TV with all the kind of crazy, flashy stuff. But it's a way that engages young people. And the elements of it are about building relationship, teaching each other, supporting each other, and reducing violence in community. And what has developed out of this is this very cohesive and now multi-generational community of people who gather like they are going to church, even though there's nothing about, you know, religion that's really stated other than the love of you know, the love of what they're doing together, and that is the dance and the community in which they are. And it's hard to express. It's hard to express easily about the feelings that you get in that group. But what we have found is that over and over and over again, young people who feel lost and have no way of connectivity suddenly discover a place where they can kind of begin to feel safe and belong, and a sense of belonging. So, you know, it is in reality a place where there is that transformation going on in a very unique and unusual way. And it's driven by the energy and the need for and the capacity for love and relationship among these diverse young people who are coming from every corner of this community, both, you know, socioeconomical background, everything. And it's created this very unusual place that I've never experienced anywhere before. So I don't know if that answers what you were asking, because it's trying to describe this community is almost like the old adage of the three blind men trying to describe different parts of an elephant. You know, unless you go and experience, it's very difficult to kind of understand the full amount of it. But what getting down to the basics is that it is an alternative place where people have people have gotten together and have created their own norm that they depend upon and they build upon, and they welcome other people in all the time.
And I was just curious because you talked about your own childhood, and you know, let's not use the word hippie, but let's use the word alternative, because that was,
yes,
until we started using other kinds of nomenclature in the 80s and so forth. The word alternative really was a really powerful term. It means we're going to do something different. We're going to organize things. We're going to value different things. We're not going to buy into the structure of things as it's given to us. And I was wondering, I mean, you absorbed, you know, some of this experimentation, the values behind this experimentation growing up, and I wonder if you see yourself living these values now as an adult in a intentional and world-changing way. And by world-changing, I don't mean some grand, global transformation. Right. I mean just in a way that matters in terms of the relationships that you have with people.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think the way I see other people and the way I try to approach other people is very much built upon how I was raised as a child, because my family and my parents were always such that it's like, if you want to do that, you commit to it, and we'll support you even if we don't understand exactly what you're doing. We'll support it, So yes, that feeling of acceptance, but that also that empowerment that you're given by the adults around you, that you are a capable human being, and you need to explore if that's what you want to explore, giving that freedom to do that. So yes, I think that definitely influences everything else that I've been doing, and the way I relate to other people, because my when you're trained that way, then more often than not you're going to turn that outward to other people.
Okay, well, great. Well, we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left in terms of our allotted time, so I want to hand the gavel back to Alan, and give him the opportunity to make some kind of final observation, including remarks, even exhortations to all of us and those who will be watching this video in the future.
Yeah, well, I want to thank both Mary and Rachel for sharing what they did, and I also maybe just spend this last 5 minutes appending a little bit of what Rachel said about youth advocates. I think what's interesting about it is that it's neither a religious community in the traditional sense of religious, or in the sense of religious that we think we know what we mean when we say religious, like the old joke about the astronomer and the shaman, and the astronomer meets the shaman and says, "Oh, I can sum up what religion is all about in about 5 words." The shaman says, "Oh, what's that?" "Oh, do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And the shaman says, "I think I can sum up what you're doing in about 5 words." The astronomer says, "What?" "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." So religion isn't what we think it is, but in terms of what we think it is, youth advocates isn't that, and it's not social services as what we think it is either. See, that's the interesting thing about it, is they're not trying to turn these kids into good citizens. There is no program like that, and in a way they've struggled to get funding because this is not what the program is about. What the program is about is precisely the gift. It's precisely the stuff that gets exchanged between people that makes community. And then that community does what it does. And as Rachel says, norms come out of that. They just do. It's an ethnogenesis in a way. And we tried to do the same thing with the Hawthorne Dinners project in Houston, which was a very simple idea. You take homeless kids who were living in this neighborhood of Montrose. And then the other people who are living in the neighborhood, which is being gentrified. So increasingly, it's I would say quasi-millennial, upwardly mobile young people who have never spent a night on the street in their lives, and for whom there is a risk that these homeless kids would be trash, that they just want off the street. And we create family-style dinners, not a soup kitchen, family-style dinners where the tables are set with tablecloths and plates, and the food is set on that you have to pass the food and serve to each other. And just to create a situation where these groups of people, you know, have to pour that wine into that glass, and then the next person has to respond to that, and then the next person has to respond to that. Not trying to control what comes out of it. And this started back in, I think, 2007. We started this.
That's right.
And it's still going on now. And they're training other groups at this point in how to work with homeless young people. So, you know, I think that there was a magic just in that simplicity. And you know, again, not trying to make these kids into good citizens, not presuming that we know even what that even means, you know, but to just create the infrastructure, sort of, for relationships and exchange to begin.
I think piggybacking, really what our intention is, or how we started it and it continues, is giving them a place where they want to be so that they will survive another day. Does that make any sense? Because many of these kids live on the edge of whatever abyss that they're looking at. And whether that's a financial abyss or whether it's because of trying to figure out who the hell they are in this world, whatever it is, you know, if they feel like they belong somewhere, then they're going to probably survive another day.
Lauren Berlant talks about the situation of so many people in global capitalism today as being in a situation of always bargaining with what is overwhelming about the present, a bargaining against the fall between the cracks, the living death of repetition that's just one step above the fall into death by drowning or hitting the concrete at full speed. That is the actual situation of so many people today. And what we have to do, instead of beginning from a place where we have some sort of grand scheme of saving the world, is to create this notion of another world being possible just out of these gestures of survival, just out of these initial gestures of survival.
Great. Okay. Alan, could you say one more quick thing about what you're doing in Bonham? Because we didn't talk about that, and that's how we introduced you.
Yes, I work with a very small, you know, annual budget of $30,000 a year. Very small nonprofit that puts out a newsletter, does a summer program every year, a leadership training summer program, and works, does community work and social activist work. And its tradition, as Rachel alluded to, is a Christian existentialist tradition, and I guess it would go something like this: that the word God, as they interpret it, is a word for the up againstness, up against which you're up against whether you like it or not. Not your idea of reality, not your idea of what is, but what resists your idea of reality, what resists your idea of what is, and what you can't escape. And the Christ event is the word that's spoken to you, that this up againstness is there. And you have a choice of how you relate to it. Holy Spirit is that relating, which is at once a wrestling and an acceptance.
Thank you very much. By the organization is called Realistic Living, and they have a website and very, very interesting venture that's going on there. It relates to this larger conversation, this larger theme. So I want to thank all our discussants tonight. This is a really fascinating conversation, at least from my standpoint. And you know, I wish you the best. And Alan, keep at it. I know you've got big ideas and you want to make them bigger. So we appreciate it. So
thank you, Carl. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Joshua.